Sarah, for putting this event together, and all of you for coming. We could have dispensed with most of that bio. That bio, the full version on the website, is only intended for my mother, and she's not here. So there are some people here who know my mother, and you can report back to her that we actually read the whole bio. You will, thank you. It is a telling time to have a discussion about Hezbollah. Just this morning, there were another set of bombings in the Dahiya, the southern suburbs of Beirut, where Hezbollah is strong, targeting Hezbollah and Iranian interests. The war in Lebanon, which started as a rebellion and became a civil war and grew with much help from Hezbollah and others too, but before the al-Qaeda elements developed in this war, there was Hezbollah helping this become a sectarian war which respects no boundaries, neither east nor west, neither to Lebanon nor into Iraq, and we're seeing the potential fallout from that right now. We've already had testimonies here on the Hill from D&I Clapper and others about the thousands upon thousands of foreign fighters who have gone to fight in that conflict. Most people focus on the foreign fighters who are fighting on the radical Sunni side of this equation, and that's something we have to be very, very focused on, because at least some of these groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda's official branch in this fight, do aspire, as the D&I put it, to carry out attacks in the homeland here in the United States. And there are at least 50 individuals who've gone from the United States to fight there, and they could come back. Our European allies are extraordinarily focused on this because there are thousands of Europeans who have gone to fight in Syria, and almost undoubtedly, if they survive the war, will come back. And unlike Afghanistan, which was far away, Syria is literally on their back step. But most people neglect to mention that there are at least as many Shia foreign fighters engaged in the war in Syria as there are Sunnis. The vast majority of them Iraqi Shia militants. Almost all of them were trained during the coalition war in Iraq to target coalition forces, and were trained by Hezbollah. There's an entire chapter in the book on Hezbollah's Unit 3800, the dedicated unit Hezbollah set up at the behest of Iran, specifically to train up Iraqi Shia militants. Think about that for a minute. When we think about Hezbollah, when we hear Hezbollah's rhetoric, Hezbollah is Lebanese first. Everything Hezbollah does, it does for the sake of Lebanon, not just for the party, not just for the Shia sectarian community of Lebanon, not just for its patron, its proxy, Iran, but everything we do, they say, is in the interest of Lebanon. But yet, in fact, they do things that have nothing to do with Lebanon. We know that when Iran wanted to send weapons to Houthi Shia rebels in Yemen, they were delivered by Hezbollah. We know that Hezbollah set up an entire dedicated unit, Unit 3800, to train up Iraqi Shia militants in Iraq. This had nothing to do with Lebanon. And now today, we see Hezbollah all in. Nasrallah's speech this week just made it even more clear. We are not going to retreat from Syria until we are victorious, and this clearly is not in the interest of Lebanon. But before we have a discussion of Syria, of Lebanon, of Hezbollah's involvement, in order to understand that at all, because keep in mind, Hezbollah's involvement in Syria has cost it tremendously at home in terms of its political standing, its social standing. To understand that, to understand why Hezbollah has gotten back into the classic, by anyone's definition, international terrorism game in ways it hasn't been since the late 1980s and early 1990s. Blowing up a bus in Bulgaria, trying to do a similar thing in Cyprus, and other attacks around the world, plots in Africa, plots in Thailand, etc. To understand that too, it's counterintuitive. Hezbollah has spent a lot of time since 9/11, which they were not involved in, but they saw 9/11 like lots of groups and said, we don't want to get caught in the crosshairs of what we were then calling the war on terrorism. And they literally withdrew some of their operatives from abroad. They wanted to stay out of the crosshairs of US and international law enforcement and intelligence. So why, you might ask yourselves, are they suddenly carrying out these attacks around the world? The answer to both questions, without trying to be simplistic or pithy, is because Iran has asked them to. I quote a senior Hezbollah official in the book as saying, the bottom line is, if you don't appreciate our sincere commitment to the principle of waliyat al-faqih, the rule of the jurisprudence, you don't understand who we are. If you don't understand our relationship to Iran, you don't understand who we are. But let's back up. Because to understand that relationship, we got to go back 30 years. Last October, we marked 30 years anniversary of the bombing of the US Marine barracks in Beirut. The French military also, they tried to hit the Italians. This was already after they'd hit the US Embassy once. It was before, just shortly before they would hit the US Embassy Annex. Again, these three attacks, the two attacks on our embassy and the one on the US Marines and the French military barracks over 18 months, really set the stage for the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah on the one hand, and the United States and the West on the other, for many, many years to come. Now, all relationships fluctuate over time, but we now know for certain that when Hezbollah made this turn to target Western interests, first in Lebanon, the French, the Americans, they tried to hit the Italians, leave the Israelis out of it for the moment, to hit Western targets. First in Lebanon, then a couple years later in Kuwait, then again in Kuwait, then they tried in Germany. When they first made the turn to targeting Western targets, not trying to just push the Israelis out, not trying to unite Shia militants to battle other sectarian communities in Lebanon, but to target Western interests, it was not because of any perceived or calculated Lebanese interest. It was because Iran asked them to. We know this for a fact. The book is full of declassified intelligence. This is no Snowden affair, it's all actually declassified. But one of the pieces of declassified intelligence you'll find in there at the beginning of the book, and it's kind of painful, I will admit, as someone who worked at the FBI just before, during, and after 9/11, I led the analytical team for Flight 175, the second flight at the Trade Center, living through one of these failures where we failed to identify and thwart this plot. That's painful. Well, it wasn't the first time. We now know from open testimony here in Washington, D.C. in federal court that 2.5 weeks before the bombing of the Marines barracks, U.S. intelligence, the NSA, intercepted a telephone call between Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security, their version of the CIA, their external intelligence organization, and the Iranian ambassador in Damascus. And the MOIS in Tehran instructs the Iranian ambassador in Damascus to reach out to a particular Shia militant, who at that point was the head of Islamic Amal, one of the largest, most important of the Shia militant groups that was already at that point coalescing under the umbrella of this new name, Hezbollah, the Party of God, which when it first started really was just an umbrella group, but pretty quickly developed into the structured, hierarchical organization that we've known it to be for 30 years. And told the ambassador to reach out to this guy, Mr. Moussaoui, and to ask him to, quote, carry out a spectacular action targeting the U.S. Marines. Problem is that this information didn't make its way through the bureaucracy and land in the desk of anybody who could do anything about it until 2 days after the bombing. That's a painful story to recount, but it's an important one because it gives us very tangible evidence of where the instructions, where the whole genesis of the idea came for this particular attack and attacks like it. And if you fast forward to today, you will find a very similar situation. The U.S. intelligence community, the DNI himself, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Matt Olson, they have since here on the Hill publicly testified what we were saying privately before, that Iran and Hezbollah today are in, and I quote, a strategic partnership with Iran as the primary partner. And that kind of a strategic partnership means you are willing to take risks to do things that are related to a core interest. Syria is a core interest. It is for Hezbollah, it's even more so for Iran. So yes, they're willing to take all kinds of risks, and they're suffering politically, socially, they're standing at home. For some European countries who agreed to designate the military and terrorist wings of Hezbollah last July, it was because of Burgas, Bulgaria, it was because of a plot in Cyprus. For others, for France, it had nothing to do with that. I met with the French. It had everything to do with Hezbollah's activity in Syria. They're paying a significant price for this, and they're willing to because they're in this strategic partnership. Now, like I said, all relationships fluctuate over time, and it might not have always been that way. Maybe at some points in time you might point and say, hey, you know, at this point in time, in this month, in this year, maybe they were more of a standard patron-proxy relationship. I give you weapons, I give you money, I give you training, and so you do something back for me in return. I'd argue that throughout their history, they've always had a much more fundamental, ideological, theological basis of common understanding. Right after the 1979 revolution, when Iran was so intent on exporting the revolution, which some in Iran are still intent on doing, though less, fewer. IRGC Quds Force, sure. Others, maybe not so much. But back then, when they all were, when they were setting up agencies and departments and line items in their budget to export the revolution. Hezbollah played a very large part in that, not only in Lebanon, but even in the Gulf, where Hezbollah operatives were sent to carry out attacks in Kuwait and elsewhere. But I digress. Before we go on, I wanna make an admission. This whole book, this whole project was not intended to be. This was not what I had planned. I had left the FBI, I was finishing a book on Hamas. I had yet to be sucked back into government, Treasury Department in that instance, before doing things part-time for state. And I got invited to a US government conference here in Washington, DC. Unclassified, but by invitation only for current and former US intelligence analysts on Lebanon and the Levant. It was co-sponsored by the CIA and State Department's INR, Intelligence and Research Branch, State Department's Diplomatic Intelligence Branch, which is actually quite good. Every panel was chaired by either someone from the agency or the State Department. But almost all the speakers were people who were brought in from Lebanon. Not all. There were a handful of Shia academics from around the United States too. But mostly journalists, academics, and the like brought in from Lebanon for this conference. Now, I'm not the type to sit down in every lecture I hear and take copious notes. But this one I did. The first couple of panels were talking not about terrorism, they were talking about things domestic in Lebanon. This is in 2003, before I started this project. And what they were talking about were things I'm very interested in, but were very well beyond my expertise. This family and its relationship with that family, this tribe and their relationship with this tribe and the mountain that divides them. Really interesting stuff. And by the way, the more you learn about Lebanon, the more you learn you have yet to learn. Wonderful people, wonderful culture, country, very, very complicated, historically suffering more than they've ever deserved, and in particular today. The first two panels, I'm taking copious notes. And then the next panel comes, and they start talking about terrorism in the Middle East, Hezbollah and Lebanon in particular. And from the moment the first speaker opened their mouths, you knew that they were coming from another dimension. It was Twilight Zone. And like a ton of bricks crashing down on my head, I'm wondering, is this panel full of lunatics? Or has the whole morning been full of lunatics? And I just didn't know, because I didn't have anything to judge the first two panels against. It was all new information for me that, I don't know. Turns out the first two panels were great. The third panel, someone gets up and they start talking about terrorism, and they say, and this was a mantra, everyone who started talking about terrorism in a kind of loony way over the course of the day always opened it with the following, or a version of the following introduction. I know you Americans and Israelis, there are no Israelis in the room, I know you Americans and Israelis believe that, ... but it's just not true. This person stood up and said, look, I know you Americans and Israelis believe that Hezbollah has done all kinds of horrible things around the world. You think they blew up the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires in 1992. You think they blew up the Amia Jewish Community Center not 2 years later, in 1994, also in Buenos Aires. You claim that they blew up the US Air Force Khobar Towers barracks in Saudi Arabia in 1996, and a whole bunch of other things, all of which you'll read about in the book. But, said the speaker, it's just not true. The Israelis don't like Hezbollah because Hezbollah fights Israeli aggression. You're close to the Israelis, so you bought the Israeli line that their behavior is, quote, terrorism, hook, line, and sinker. But really, this is not mature. Let's be mature about this. They're a militant group. They're fighting Israeli occupation. This is 3 years after the Israelis withdrew from southern Lebanon in 2000. But okay, something somewhere is occupied. And therefore, we have to have a serious discussion about this. Now, Al-Qaeda, they do all those things, and I'm sure they did those terrible things that you attribute to Hezbollah too. But Hezbollah doesn't do these things. I'm telling you, they don't. I'm from Lebanon, I know. This is an audience of 200 plus current and former US intelligence analysts who have worked this issue. It is co-sponsored by the CIA, for whom Hezbollah is a personal issue. Hezbollah took out our station in Lebanon when they blew up the embassy, including some very senior Middle East analysts who happened to be visiting at the time. We sent a new guy, Bill Buckley, to set up a new station. Hezbollah kidnapped him, brutally tortured him, sent us videos several times, really nasty stuff, eventually killed him. According to some of the hostages that were held with him, some of them believed that the man who killed him was Imad Mughniyeh himself. Okay, you're going to come to a CIA-sponsored conference, a room full of people who've worked this issue. We're not new to this, and you're going to say Hezbollah doesn't do these things? Rule number one about public speaking, know your audience. I'm not one who suffers fools very well. It's actually a tremendous flaw of mine. And I'm already sitting in my seat and I'm uncomfortable, I'm shaking. All my friends saying, look at Matt, he's getting all annoyed, doesn't take very much. But the other speakers on that panel weren't quite so egregious, and by the end of that panel, I had calmed down. They'd already said that the questions and answers were going to have to be saved for the end of the day. So I'm taking notes about how I want to rip this person to shreds. Okay, fine. The next panel comes up, the first speaker gets up and says, I know you Americans and Israelis believe, here we go again, that there's some boogeyman out there, says the speaker, making light. Some boogeyman out there named Imad Mugnia. Supposedly some arch-terrorist, who's on your FBI's most wanted list and does all these terrible things. Well, I want you to know, said this American-born academic who's lived in Beirut for many years, that I live in Beirut, and I know of no evidence he exists. Think about that for a minute, because the head of the terrorist wing is going to go up to him and say, hey, I'm Imad Mugnia, and anytime you want to catch a cup of Joe, I'm just down the street. I know of no evidence he exists, this person says. So I did what a real academic would do. Dramatic pause. I asked, and I pestered, and I pestered, and I asked, and I finally got an interview with Hassan Nasrallah himself, the Secretary General of Hezbollah. We sat down eye to eye, and I said to him, Yes Sayyid, using his honorific, does Mugnia exist? And he told me no. Okay? Enough. Ergo, Mugnia doesn't exist, QED. Now I'm all rattled up again, right? Mugnia is a personal issue for many of us in the room, for the people in the CIA. I know people who passed over promotions because this is personal. Now I'm all aggravated again. And I approached this person after the panel, and let's just say that we mostly, but not entirely politely, agreed to disagree. This is 2003. Now this led to the whole book because I leave this conference and I think to myself, how is this possible? This is not a conference of conspiracy theorists. The State Department, the CIA, this is serious people. And of course, in the Q&A, I and others made our points. But how is this possible? I thought to myself, maybe it's me. Maybe the things that I know so well to be true, I know because I've worked these issues in government, in the classified domain. Maybe in the unclassified domain, it's not quite so clear. So my poor research assistant was given the task of doing an incredibly deep dive, everything ever written on Hezbollah. Newspapers, journals, books, you name it, I've got it. And what it turned out was that back in 2003, and certainly much more so now today, there was a huge chunk of literature out there on Hezbollah. But almost none of it focused on Hezbollah's terrorist activities, its activities outside of Lebanon, its fundraising, logistics, criminal activity, procurement, none of it. If you wanted to know about Hezbollah's political position, its function as part of the fabric of Lebanese politics and society, which it is, you could read about that. If you wanted to know about its social welfare activity and its provision of humanitarian support, you could read about that. If you even wanted to know about some of its militant activities as a militia, the Islamic Resistance Militia, there's a lot you could read about that. But almost nothing on this. The one book that actually had a chapter on this ended with a question mark. Hezbollah terrorism, question mark? And unlike all the other chapters, which were 20, 30, 40 pages, this one is 7. And every paragraph started with, according to the Israelis this, according to the Americans that, according to the Israelis this, according to the Americans that. Because clearly no one but the Israelis and Americans had ever talked about this. In fact, all you had to do was ask people, interview people, collect the documents that were out there, and there's a huge amount of information. No one bothered to seek the court documents from Buenos Aires. No one bothered to seek the court documents from the cases in France, in Italy, in Switzerland, in Germany, Singapore, the Philippines, Chile, that were all out there for the asking. I know because I did. It took me 9 years, not a whole time working on the book. Part of that time I was back in government, not looking at this one bit. But over about 6 years of actually working on this, me traveling the world, me pestering people who are traveling here to Washington, begging and pestering, and apparently I can pester good enough to get the documents I wanted, you're able to put together a tremendous amount of material. This book is pretty long. We had to cut 40,000 words out of the book because it was too long. That's how much information is out there. Now, fast forward to February 2008, when somebody puts an explosive in the headrest of a Mitsubishi Pajero in Damascus that happened to belong to a guy who actually did exist, named Imad Mugnia, but whose existence was denied in life because he was the head of Hezbollah's terrorist wing and was embraced in death and given new titles, and billboards go up, and squares and streets named after him, embraced in death. And someone assassinates him as he comes out of a meeting with Syrian military intelligence. A whole interesting story about that. I wrote an article in the Weekly Standard about it last week. I can direct you to it. The Iranians, the Hezbollah both, their first instinct was that Syria might have played some role in it. They're since quite convinced that the Israelis did it. I just want to know who to thank as an American. Forget the Israelis. As an American, no man was responsible for the deaths of more Americans before 9/11 than Imad Mugni. I lose not a wink of sleep. But when this news broke, since I'm not a very nice person and I'm not a very mature person, I sat down at my computer and I wrote a very short email to this academic from this conference 5 years earlier in 2003. I drafted this email. It was very, very short. It just said, and now we're both right. He did exist. And now he doesn't. My wife, who some of you know, is a much more mature person than I am, and said to me, Matt, maybe that's not the most mature thing you can do. So I didn't send the email, and I admit to being petty, because I felt pretty damn good afterwards anyway, even just for having drafted it. Now, a couple of days later at his funeral, Nasrallah himself, who had told this individual that Mugniya doesn't exist, appears at Mugniya's funeral, not in person by video teleconference for fear that he'll be the next target, and says, Israel, you want, and this is his words, not mine, you want open war, quote unquote, I'll give you open war. And the Israelis take this as it was meant, correctly, that Hezbollah was intending to avenge Mugniya's death at a time and place somewhere around the world, open war outside of the immediate arena, to avenge his death at a time and place of their choosing. Now remember, when he makes this threat, we know for certain neither Nasrallah nor Iran are entirely convinced that the Israelis are responsible. That doesn't make a difference. Someone gets a cold in Poughkeepsie, and you ask Hezbollah, that's the Israelis' fault too. This is their default. The Israelis didn't have to wait very long before the first in a series of operations targeting current or former senior Israeli officials. Remember, Mugniya was the prince of Hezbollah. Succeeded in his role as the head of the Islamic Jihad organization, Hezbollah's terrorist wing, by his brother-in-law and best buddy, Mustafa Badruddin, who is currently in absentia on trial for the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafi Hariri at the UN's tribunal, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon in The Hague. But to avenge the death of someone who's the prince of Hezbollah, you have to hit someone who's somewhere equal value, current or former senior Israeli official. First was a plot targeting the Israeli ambassador in Baku in late 2008. There were about a dozen plots after that, some Hezbollah, some Quds Force, some combined in Baku, Azerbaijan. Later, plots to kidnap or kill people in Africa, mostly retired Israeli generals who are now in business, mostly in development, getting clean water and whatnot for African countries. There were plots all over the world, and each one of them fails. And my theory, as I told you before, is that Hezbollah had actually withdrawn some of its trigger pullers from abroad after 9/11. But they withdrew not a single one of their logisticians, procurement officers, criminal fundraisers from around the world, and these continued. And as you'll read the book, you'll travel with them through South America, North America, Europe, the Middle East, but also Africa, and maybe most amazingly, Southeast Asia. Most people aren't aware that just weeks before Hezbollah successfully blew up the Amia Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires in 1994, they came this close to successfully blowing up the Israeli embassy in Bangkok. And the only reason that that didn't happen wasn't because the Israelis or the Americans or the Thais or anybody else knew anything about it or frustrated it. We didn't. Not one of us. It's because the suicide bomber, parenthetically, it's kind of interesting, the only case I know of where Hezbollah deployed an Iranian suicide bomber early on, gets into a car accident, a fender bender, on his way to the Israeli embassy. Fender bender with one of those three-wheel tic-tac taxis in downtown Bangkok. Like in Buenos Aires, they parked the vehicle explosive, the car bomb, in a car lot close to the target the night before. He didn't have very far to go, but literally he pulls out of the parking garage and gets into a fender bender and flees the scene. It's an amazing, amazing story, which I wasn't aware of till I got the full story from the Singaporeans and the Thais and the Filipinos. In any event, because they had withdrawn these people from abroad, when they finally wanted to avenge Mugniya's death in 2008, they just didn't have the capabilities like they once had. And so they approached the Iranians in 2009. They said, listen, Mugniya was important to you, and it's true, we believe he was most likely dual-hatted as a commissioned officer in the Quds Force by the time he was killed. And he's important to us. You got to help us with a little more logistical support than usual. The Iranians say absolutely. And they come up with a plot targeting the Israeli consul general in an assassination plot in Istanbul, Turkey. And this is September 2009, and this too is thwarted. And now you have the situation, kind of delicious situation, at the end of 2009, these last few weeks, where Hezbollah and Iran are really angry at each other. They're yelling at each other. You, Hezbollah, you used to be the best of the best. People called you the A-team. You could do things with reasonable deniability. You go in, you go out, nobody knows what happened, forget about it. Now, you fail, you fail, you fail, you fail again. And you, Iran, you used to be a reliable supporter. I could count on you for logistical support or whatever I needed. Now, you're more than a little bit distracted by this nuclear program. And their argument is put to bed not because they resolved their differences, but because a few weeks later, in January 2010, something completely separate happens. Somebody gets on a motorcycle with a magnetic sticky bomb, pulls up alongside the car of Professor Mohammadi, a particularly important Iranian nuclear physicist, reportedly working in their nuclear program, slaps this magnetic sticky bomb onto his car, pulls away, the car blows up, Mohammadi is killed. The Iranians, as you can imagine, are pretty upset, as we would be if something like that happened on the streets of Washington or Paris or what have you. And they call in the Quds Force, and they call in Hezbollah, and they say, enough, no more bickering. This is how it will be. Remember, waliyat al-faqih, rule of the jurisprudent. Quds Force, I've got a task for you. Hezbollah, I've got two tasks for you. Quds Force, you're first. You're going to establish a brand new unit, we're going to call it Unit 400. And you are going to target diplomats from countries who are trying to undermine our nuclear program. Go. Certainly they were going to target the Israelis. You may recall 3 plots in 24 hours a couple of Februaries ago in Thailand, in the Republic of Georgia, in India. But they also targeted British officials in West Africa. And again, came this close to assassinating the US ambassador, other members of the US embassy staff, and crossing an unwritten rule, members of their families as well, again in Baku, Azerbaijan. Reportedly a plot briefed to the president multiple times. That's how far along it was. What's interesting is that Unit 400 was co-led by 2 individuals, both of them relative income groups. It's a whole long story as to why that happens, but it does, with the Iranians promoting incompetence. One of them is someone we knew well. At one point he was in Los Angeles, doing surveillance of Iranian dissidents. The largest Iranian expatriate community in the world is in the greater Los Angeles area. Many of those people are kind of uptight. What can I do against this regime which is so horrible? And so many of them have these laptop computer radio programs. Each of them probably has 1 to 7 listeners a year. One of them apparently was saying really egregious things against the regime. And this guy in Los Angeles, this Iranian agent, decides that he decides, or he's tasked, it's unclear, but he's going to assassinate this person with the radio program in Los Angeles. And he decides that the best thing to do, the most efficient thing, was to be put a bullet in his head. But instead, he's going to rent a truck and run him over. Why? Because he determines it's too difficult to procure a handgun in Los Angeles. Deputy Commissioner for Counterterrorism at LAPD is a friend of mine. I told him the story, couldn't stop laughing. My 14-year-old, and if you're listening ever, watching this video, don't. My 14-year-old could get a handgun in Los Angeles. That's what we're up against. They never succeeded. The closest they came to success was in India, where they literally gave up and couldn't get past the Israeli countermeasures, and finally said, forget about it. Whatever the next car is that comes out of that embassy, we're sticky bombing it. We're pulling up alongside in a motorcycle and slapping a magnetic bomb on it, and that's it. And they had no idea who was in this car. Turned out to be the wife of the Israeli defense attaché. Thankfully, she was on the way to get the children from school. There were no children yet in the car. She was very badly injured, but she survived. The driver was also badly injured. You can't exactly call that a success. Hezbollah, meanwhile, was given 2 tasks, and they're all excited. The first task is stop. Just stop, because you're not doing so well. So I want you to take 6, 7, 8 months off, and I want you to recruit the creme de la creme from your militia, from the Islamic resistance. Get me people with foreign languages, foreign complexions, people who've traveled, preferably people who have dual nationalities, 2 passports, a non-Lebanese passport, and train them in the dark arts. We'll train them in the dark arts, and then, and only then, you go and assassinate Israeli tourists around the world. I know, say the Iranians. You want to hit a current or former senior Israeli official to avenge Mugnia's death, hitting some tourist. That's not enough. This is different. You want to continue targeting Israeli officials? Fine, we'll support you. But to exact a cost on the Israelis for what we, the Iranians, perceive them to be doing to our nuclear program, this is all you need to do. The Israelis are very sensitive to any loss. This will send a very clear message. And these are softer targets that are easier to hit, and we want it done in the near term. And this is exactly what happens. You have the plot in Burgas, Bulgaria, involving 2 dual Lebanese Canadians and 1 dual Lebanese Australian. You have the plot a week and a half beforehand in Cyprus involving a dual Lebanese Swedish citizen. He was the second Lebanese-Swedish dual citizen Hezbollah operative to have been arrested within 6 months. Hussein Yaku was arrested in Cyprus 6 months earlier. Hussein Atris was arrested in Thailand. But I want to burst your bubble for those of you who watch Homeland and, you know, all those shows. And it's not necessarily the case that when you engage in operations with the best operational security, which as well as the capability to do, that you necessarily succeed. And that when you make mistakes, you necessarily fail. I'm going to give you a short description of the Burgas, Bulgaria plot and the Cyprus plot, and we'll end, and we'll take questions, and then you'll buy the book, and we'll all be happy. And I'll thank you in advance from the bottom, and I do mean the bottom of my 4 sons' college funds. Burgas, Bulgaria, which was actually the second of the 2 plots, succeeded. 6 people were killed, 5 Israelis, 1 Bulgarian, and many more wounded. I've been to Bulgaria. I've met with the 2 agents from the Bulgarian version of the FBI, SANS, who are investigating this case. I've met with the head of their intelligence service and others. And they'll be the first to admit that there's a little bit of embarrassment that no one from the government actually went to the funerals. The funeral of the Bulgarian, actually, because he was a Muslim Bulgarian. And in the first instance, there was tremendous concern that maybe he was a radical, maybe it was an inside job. In fact, we now know that he tried to move the bus at the last minute and tried to save lives. And if anything, was a hero. The first community of any kind in Bulgaria to have paid respects to him was the local synagogue, which put up 6 candles, not 5. These guys came into the country through different ways, through Poland, through Romania, left through different ways. But we now know that for all of their success, and there was success, there were multiple failures in this operation. The Israelis have come out publicly and said that they, for a few months, a few weeks anyway, had tracked phone conversations, or at least phone calls. It's not clear if there was content, between a known operational senior bad guy in Hezbollah in Beirut and unknown individuals in Burgas, Bulgaria. Those calls go dead July 18th, the day of the bombing, parenthetically, the day of the anniversary of the Amiya bomb. So we're quite certain that this was one connection. So it wasn't perfect operational security because Israelis knew something, but they hadn't yet been able to drill down, figure out who was at the receiving end of these calls in Burgas, but they knew something was afoot. Parenthetically, by the way, Israelis, the US, a bunch of places had identified several years earlier places where Iran or Hezbollah might attack if they ever wanted to, and on the short list of countries several years earlier was Bulgaria, among other countries, sitting at the periphery of Europe, easily accessed, cross borders, etc. But there's more than just that. At first we thought that it was a suicide bombing because one of the bombers, one of the dual Lebanese Canadians, was killed in the blast. We now know it wasn't. We now know that this was remotely detonated, which means, we think, from interviewing some of the Israelis who survived, that this is what happened. The bomber, who you might have seen the picture, this is from a piece of mine which you can pull up on our website, Hezbollah and Quds Force and around Shadow War with the West, which draws from the concluding chapter of the book, a picture of him in terms of the surveillance camera at Burgas Airport. We now know that he waits at the airport, kind of joins the group as they're leaving the airport to go to their buses, and puts his backpack bomb under the bus where he wanted it. Maybe he was right in the center of the bus. For whatever reason, he wanted that there. To put it there, he moved a suitcase that an Israeli tourist had just placed where he wanted his suitcase and moved it over. God bless the Israelis, but sometimes they can be particular. This particular Israeli tourist, he really wanted his suitcase where he put it. This was important to him. And they get into an argument. You can move my suitcase. That's what and they get into an argument. Apparently, the 2 other Hezbollah guys, one of whom was related to the person who ends up dying, the other dual Lebanese Canadian, see this. They don't really know what's happening. Presumably, they're watching through binoculars. They see there's something going on, an argument. They get nervous. They hit the device. It goes off, including killing their friend and relative in the process. Another mistake. There were a host of other mistakes, but the biggest one, my favorite one, is this. Hezbollah has second to none counterfeit capabilities. Counterfeit documents, counterfeit money. Some incredible stories in the book about counterfeit money operations, stings that we have done here. FBI has done some incredible penetrations of Hezbollah, including sending undercover sources to Lebanon and luring Hezbollah guys here for incredible sting operations where they posed as Philadelphia mobsters, and incredible stories. But in this case, they made a big mistake. The guy who died, we got his license, and you can pull it up online. In fact, I have it as a subset over here. You can't see it from a distance, but you can go up online afterwards. You can pull up his Michigan fake license. Now, licenses in the United States are usually good for about 10 years after your first preliminary. So it wasn't the latest Michigan license, but it was within 10 years, and it was a beautiful, beautiful fabrication. Hologram, the whole bit. Stunning, stunning, dangerously stunning fake Michigan license. But two problems. The first one is the picture. You'll see the picture. He's wearing a wig, which looks like a Saturday Night Live wig. You look at this and you're like, why is he wearing a wig? It's so obviously a wig. But maybe that's not on the forger's shoulders. I picture a guy in a darkened room with one of those banker's lights over his workspace, and someone comes in and says, sir, I have the picture for the license, and hands him this piece of garbage picture, and the guy says, you want me to put this ridiculous picture into my masterpiece of a license? But this is the only picture he has, so what is he going to do? Maybe that's not on him. But what is on him? And I can't explain this. No one I've spoken to can explain this. Maybe someone was knocking on the door saying, forger, we need it now, hurry up, hurry up. We don't know. But if you look at this license, this Michigan state license, the address on the license is in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Now, mind you, the young woman who was working the summer job at the car rental desk at the Burgas, Bulgaria airport didn't know. The way you might not know, if you hadn't looked at a map, that Burgas, Bulgaria is on the far eastern side of the country, as opposed to Sofia, the capital, on the far western side of the country. We don't tend to know Bulgarian geography so well. Some of them may not know that there's a little bit of distance between Michigan and Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And he was able to rent the car just fine. She did report that she noticed he was suspicious. He was behaving suspiciously, seemed nervous, but she didn't report it for two reasons. One, she admitted, which is if you reported to everybody who acts suspiciously when they're traveling, you'd be reporting a lot of people. People get aggravated, people are overtired, but the other thing is, and I noticed this when I went and I met with the director of the Bulgarian intelligence service. Like all intelligence service chiefs, you walk into his office. Right outside the office is a big curio cabinet with all of his stuff, and they're all KGB. Until a few years ago, this was a Soviet satellite KGB state. There is not a culture in this country of voluntarily going to the police unless you have to. So they didn't. They made mistakes, and yet they succeeded. Compare that with Cyprus, a week and a half earlier, where they did some really, really careful, slow, methodical training and preparation, textbook, really good tradecraft, and failed. Husam Yakub is found out somehow by the Israelis, who tell the Cypriots, who don't arrest him right away and surveil him. And they literally follow him as he leaves his hotel, gets on a bus, goes back to the airport, conducts surveillance of Israelis getting off their chartered plane and onto their buses. This is clearly not the op yet. This is just surveillance to see if it can be done. He's writing down the license plate numbers of the buses in not very sophisticated code, and then he goes back to his hotel. They get an arrest warrant, they get a search warrant, it's all by the books. They arrest him, he says, what are you talking about? I haven't been back to the airport since I got here. I come to Cyprus all the time, what are you talking about? And they said, really? Because here's the surveillance footage of you at the airport just a few hours ago, and here are the still photographs of you. Oh, okay, fine, I went to the airport, but there's no law against going to the airport. They have very good coffee at the airport. Really? Because here's you taking down the license plate numbers, and they have him dead to rights. Now, the first few interrogation sessions, and I have all the interrogation reports from the Cypriots in English in the official government translated reports, an official translator. In the first few interrogation series, he denies, of course I've heard of Hezbollah, I live in Lebanon, I grew up in Sweden, but I live in Lebanon, everybody's heard of Hezbollah, they're a political party, and yeah, they're a militia, but I'm not involved. And I've been coming to Cyprus for years. First I came here to vacation, then I came here to do business. I come all the time, there's some misunderstanding, but eventually he starts cracking. The whole thing has a sense of training to it. In English, here we call it R2I, resistance to interrogation. And again, in the real world, you're trained not to never break under interrogation. You're trained to try and buy some time, a few days, a week, 2 weeks. And there's several cases of this, Hezbollah guys doing this in the book. The best one is a guy who was captured in Iraq, Ali Musaddiq al-Musawi, who pretended to be deaf-dumb for several weeks, which takes a lot of skill. In any event, eventually the Sunni group says, fine, listen, I am Hezbollah. Okay, I am. I was approached randomly in the street at a falafel stand in downtown Beirut by some guy named Rami. Why he approached me, I don't know. But all I'm doing here is just a little surveillance, just looking to see what's around. Hezbollah is not a banned entity in Lebanon. It's not even a banned entity here in Cyprus. This is before the Europeans banned the military and terrorist wings of Hezbollah. I wasn't concerned about terrorism. Al-Qaeda, they do terrorism. Eventually, towards the very end, he says, hey, by the way, remember I told you I was recruited by some guy named Rami? He doesn't exist. And he starts telling the whole story of how he was recruited. And I'll ask you, when do you think he was recruited? Because I've given you two hints. You might say, well, maybe he was recruited in January 2010, when I told you that Iran instructed Hezbollah to recruit people just like him to carry out attacks on Israeli tourists. And that would be a brilliant, well-founded guess, and it would be wrong. And then you might speculate, okay, fine, but you also told me that after Mubnia's assassination in February 2008, Hezbollah wanted to carry out a revenge attack, and so maybe he was recruited then. And that also would be a very well-founded, logical, wrong answer. He was recruited more than a year earlier. Because throughout the period of times when Hezbollah was not carrying out actual operations, they never stopped preparing. They never stopped recruiting people and laying the groundwork for potential operations. And he admits that when he was first recruited and given some training, he was first told, fine, you're now ready for your first test. We're going to send you as a courier to Turkey, Antalya, Turkey. You're going to find a guy in the following corner outside the following mall wearing the following clothing at the following time of day. And when you see him, you will deliver this package to him. Don't ask what's in it, just deliver the package. Clearly it was a test, and he was being followed. He comes back and says, listen, good news and bad news. Bad news, it wasn't real, it was a test. Good news, you passed. And now you can get the next level of training. And then they tell him, now you're ready for your real operation. This time we're really going to use you as a courier. You're going to deliver stuff to Hezbollah guys around the world. You're going to bring stuff to us back from them. And where you might ask, might he be sent? Maybe South America, maybe somewhere in the Middle East. How about Lyon, France? How about Amsterdam? How about feeding this information to the Europeans as they were considering whether or not to ban Hezbollah's military and terrorist wings? It wasn't just Cyprus and Burgas. It wasn't just what they were doing in Syria. It was evidence that they were recruiting people from and in Europe, Denmark, Sweden, all kinds of places, that they were doing things in Lyon, in Amsterdam. It was very, very powerful. Eventually he's told, listen, now you're ready for your next operation, which is go on vacation. Nothing else. You go to Cyprus, our treat, you meet people. You're just going to start building a cover story. Again, not like on Homeland, where she needs to go to Beirut and suddenly she's given a cover story, make-believe, and she's got to memorize what her pretend mother-in-law's favorite ice cream flavor is. The best cover story is you, traveling not on your Lebanese passport, but on your real Swedish passport. And you go months, years in advance, visiting a country like Cyprus, and you go, and you go, and you go, and you go again. First few times as a tourist, and you meet people who now know you and would vouch for you. And eventually you say to your buddies, hey, you know, I see business opportunities here. Can you help me open a bank account? Can you find me a storage facility? I'm thinking of importing Lebanese juices to Cyprus and exporting the Cypriot trinkets back to Lebanon. And you have a reason for being, and you have a reason for coming. He eventually admits that even before he came on this last trip and did the surveillance of the Israeli tourists at the airport, he was tasked with doing other surveillance on earlier trips. They had specific interests. They wanted to know about two specific hotels. One hotel, he did the surveillance. The other was undergoing reconstruction, and so he couldn't do it. They wanted to know details about a particular parking lot, sandwiched between a hospital and the parking police, the traffic police. Is it indoor or outdoor? Is it 24 hours? Do you leave a key? Do you get a tag? Is there a 24-hour attendant? All kinds of details, which doesn't seem like much, except that, as I told you, in both Thailand and Buenos Aires, when they had a car bomb ready to go, they parked it in a parking lot near a Target the night before. I can't tell you that's why they were interested in it, but when Hezbollah gets that kind of interest in a parking garage, I get concerned. And he was also tasked with seeing if there's a place that serves kosher. That's how they put it. He didn't know what that meant. He had to look it up. Well, there isn't. There's no place in Cyprus that serves kosher food, and that either means that Hezbollah has a real craving for some good kosher cooking, or they were looking for people who might be interested in eating kosher food. And I'd suggest it's the latter. And the reason is because in the last session with the Cypriot police, as he is at this point completely come open and told them the whole story, but is maintaining throughout, because he really believes it, that this is not terrorism. Hezbollah doesn't do terrorism, this is resistance. He's saying to them, look, I told you I was Hezbollah, yes. And okay, I did this surveillance of these buses, but this is not terrorism, he says. And I quote, these are not my words, the official English translation of the Greek, certified by the Greek government, by a certified Greek translator. Quote, I was just carrying out surveillance of the Jews. This is what my organization does all over the world. Not with an exclamation point at the end, but with a, you see, what's the big deal? This is just part and parcel of what we do. It's just surveillance of the Jews. We do it all over the world. Well, I have an issue with that. I suggest we all should have an issue with that. And when you think about what Hezbollah is doing in Syria today, Hezbollah is a really, really big problem. Not just at home in Lebanon, and not just in the region where it is spreading sectarianism, a problem we will be dealing with, I guarantee you, and I would love to be wrong and eat my hat for the next decade. You will have to, 10 years from now, remind people that there was instability in Libya where we actually did intervene compared to the problem that's blossoming now in Syria that we'll be dealing with for much, much longer, with much greater ramifications. And there's no evidence that Hezbollah's activities beyond the region are off the shelf. It's just that Hezbollah doesn't have the bandwidth to do all these things at once. It is completely distracted by its all-in investment in Syria. And so we do see a petering off of some of these plots. We hear some of these things are continuing, but they're not happening at the kind of 110% operational tempo that they once were. All over the place, from surveillance of Israeli tourists at the airport in Johannesburg to former Soviet republics and a bunch of places in between. And our explanation is that they are just that distracted. Allow me to stop there and take any questions you may have in the interim. We have flyers to look everywhere you like. I want to thank Emmet and Sarah and her team, of course, for hosting this event. I want to thank you all for coming, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.